the world is trying so hard to address the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, but it seems it's not enough because the sanctions are still on the Taliban, and even they're trying to connect to the outside world. They're calling on relation with other countries, including US. What has to be done? What's your recommendation?
Well, I think what has to be done is there have to be ways determined to provide assistance to the people without, frankly, enriching the Taliban or even strengthening their position. Clearly, the US is not going to recognize the Taliban. It's not going to reestablish its embassy as such. It could be that we might reoccupy it for some various tasks, but it won't be as if we have recognized the Taliban as the leadership of the country. But certainly the prospect of a very, very dire humanitarian situation is already being realized. It's already being recognized. A number of different organizations are on the ground. We could support a number of those if we work hard enough to find creative ways to provide the financing for them. And to be fair, the United States has already sent hundreds of millions of dollars. I suspect it's once again the largest donor to Afghanistan, but it's nowhere near enough to fill the gap that is left by the implosion of the economy as the Taliban have taken over, the collapse of their banking system, the extraordinary challenge that they have coming in a year that had one of the worst droughts in 35 years and so forth. So the challenges are enormous. I mean, winter is always hard in Afghanistan. It is particularly hard this year. And if we're to rescue people from starvation, literally, we're going to have to figure out, again, creative ways, thoughtful ways that we can provide assistance to people, provide the life-saving subsistence supplies and get that to them. And I think that's very doable. A number of us, two other former commanders, a number of the diplomats over the years released a statement on that recently, and we believe very strongly that that is what should happen.
So what do you think is the main reason for US not recognizing the Taliban? Even the Taliban are offering and they're calling to have relationship with other countries.
Well, I don't think we can recognize the Taliban until they actually do what it is that we believe they should do, and what they have at various times said they would do, but have not done, which is to provide certain human rights to individuals, to provide security for all, to allow women to work, to resume their place in society, to allow girls to get an education. I mean, the list is quite long. And again, the Taliban has shown no consistent commitment to any of these. And clearly, we should not recognize them if that is the case. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't try to keep people from starving in the very cold winter that is now setting in Afghanistan.
So former Afghanistan NSA advisor Hamdallah Mohib was in an interview with VOA, says that collapse of Afghanistan government is as a result of this long negotiation in Doha. But while now the negotiation is going on between Taliban and the US, do you think Taliban will now perhaps agree with an inclusive government with the new negotiations, or do you see any results coming in?
I'm a bit doubtful, to put it mildly. And again, the collapse of the Afghan government was brought about by a number of different factors. One of those certainly was just the lack of American strategic patience, the withdrawal of our forces, and also the withdrawal of the contractors that kept the Afghan Air Force flying, a whole host of different factors that led to that. But again, Afghan leaders, I think, should do a little bit of inward looking as well and ask whether they lacked fortitude, didn't succumb to a variety of different corrupt and political nepotistic and a variety of other practices that weakened that government so substantially, and that prevented it from providing the kind of determined and forthright leadership at its hour of greatest need. I think there were some considerable failures there. They could have certainly fought on much longer if they designed a defensive strategy that would have been sustainable instead of trying to defend everything, which meant that you defend nothing, and on and on. But the issue right now is, I think, that it's very unlikely that the Taliban will meet the requirements of the United States and of the other coalition countries, I should add. This is not just the United States making these requests, these demands. It's all of those dozens and dozens of countries that were supporting Afghanistan and the Afghan people over the last 20 years. Their challenge, of course, is that they are finding out that it's a lot harder to be counterinsurgents than it is insurgents. It's much harder to be in charge of government instead of criticizing those who are trying to govern. It's vastly harder to run an economy nowadays than it was some 20 or 25 years ago when the Taliban took and held power. So all of these issues are confronting them. There's a growing resistance movement in the country carrying out violent attacks. There is a growing challenge from the Islamic State Khorasan group, the affiliate in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region that is also carrying out attacks, many of them in Kabul and other major cities. So they have huge security challenges, and they're really struggling to keep their own movement together. There is friction between the Taliban and the Haqqani element of the Taliban. The Haqqani are by and large running the government with the Taliban leadership having withdrawn to Kandahar. Certainly there's still coordination, cooperation, conversation between them, but it appears that the Haqqani have prevailed. The individuals in charge of different ministries don't give us a great deal of confidence. The Minister of Interior, for example, has a $5 million price on his head. So again, I think it's very unlikely that the Taliban will accede to the requests that have been made on them by the international community, in part because they just don't believe in that. It is just contrary to their ideology, to their interpretation of Islam, which is one of those, it's back to the 7th century kind of interpretation of Islam. And also because they would lose some of the more extreme or ultra-conservative members of their own movement who might defect to the Islamic State Khorasan group or perhaps to a revived Al-Qaeda or some other entity. So they're in a very, very difficult position. And I think that what we will see tragically is what I have talked to you about before, which is that I fear a return to very substantial violence and essentially a degree of civil war between the different ethnic and sectarian and political and religious factions in the country.
So U.S. end of war and chaotic departure from Afghanistan is widely criticized. And do you think there's any option on the table for U.S. return to the region? Because some experts recommend that the over-the-horizon mission is not enough to stop the terrorists coming back to Afghanistan, and ISK traitors as well is still existing. And also if you can comment on Northern Alliance Resistance Front by Ahmad Massoud as well. So what has to be, do you think there's any option that US may decide to go back to Afghanistan or to the region?
Well, to the region, perhaps. Again, the United States has sought bases in the Central Asian states. I suspect we've had conversations with Pakistan, which have not gone well, I'm sure, about reestablishing a base there as well, which we did have until, I don't know, 8 or so years ago. So the region is conceivable. Afghanistan, I think, is inconceivable, at least for the very near term, not just because of the challenges of doing that, but because of the domestic politics of it in the United States as well. Clearly, there is a threat that is growing. You see it mostly, again, in Afghanistan, domestically in Afghanistan, from the Islamic State Khorasan group, as I mentioned, increasing numbers of attacks. You do see the resistance movement, although it's fragmented, it's different groupings generally aligned with different ethnic elements of the northern part of Afghanistan. The son of Ahmad Shah Massoud certainly does seem to have not only survived the offensive that the Taliban mounted against the Panjshir Valley and his particular movement, but seems to be actually in the counteroffensive mode. So again, the Taliban very much have their work cut out for them. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a lot easier to be an insurgent group than it is to be a counterinsurgent group and responsible for defending everything instead of just attacking where you want to from time to time. And indeed, they're also, of course, running low undoubtedly on various resources that are crucial. Keep in mind that we used to fund the entire Afghan National Security Force in personnel costs and operating costs and equipment costs. Obviously, that is no longer present. They may have, indeed, they did take ownership, if you will, took over many of the vehicles and weapons and so forth left by Afghan National Security Force members when they either surrendered, fled, what have you. But those aren't all that good if you don't have the fuel, the spare parts, the ammunition, and all the rest, the maintenance to keep it functioning. And I suspect that over time, we will see a degradation in the operational readiness of the Taliban forces, which will add another challenge for their efforts to try to secure the country.
So Pakistan hosted the OAC conference with Islamic leaders and calling all these nations to stay engaged in Afghanistan. So do you think Pakistan is trying to somehow connect Taliban to the outside world, and eventually it will be Taliban's recognition by these countries or some of these countries?
Clearly, what Pakistan is trying to do is to determine how to mitigate the risk of the humanitarian catastrophe that will overwhelm them as well as Afghanistan. As people grow more desperate, as starvation really sets in, as the prospects of being able to feed families grow dim, there will be millions of Afghans over time who will ultimately find their way into Pakistan, just as they did, by the way, back in the days of the civil war in the mid-1990s and when the Taliban took over then, but even more dire in certain respects. So you'll see Pakistan being the beneficiary, if you will, in quotes, of the outpouring of individuals from Afghanistan. Certainly there will be some that will go to the Central Asian states and to Iran, but the bulk of these will, I think, flood into Pakistan, and they're desperately trying to figure out how they can keep people in Pakistan or in Afghanistan rather than coming to their soil, what they would have to provide for them in some fashion, noting how fragile Pakistan is in its own fiscal situation. It just also received a new grant from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to keep it afloat. It is always challenged with its hard currency dwindling and so forth. So I suspect that there's a degree of desperation in what it is that they're trying to do. And, it may lead to recognition by, again, some countries that are party to this. And again, we should commend those countries that are concerned in humanitarian situations such as this, albeit not supporting certainly the Taliban's form of rule and interpretation of Islam.
So about human rights reports on killing of a former member of the Afghan forces, also Amnesty International taking everyone responsible for the war crimes as well. What's your thoughts about these reports coming in? What has to be done to protect these guys? Like they serve in military and are still in Afghanistan. It is their country and they serve for their country, but now they're at risk and they're being killed.
Yeah, it's one of the many disturbing elements of the situation in Afghanistan right now that the Taliban have said, just lay down your weapons, we'll reconcile, don't worry. And what they've actually been doing in various parts of the country is identifying and going after those who served in certain units of the Afghan National Security Forces, some of those that were in certain positions at certain levels. And again, many, many accounts of that have been coming out from Afghanistan. It's very, very troubling. And clearly, it's another example. It validates the assertion that many of us have made that we have left behind hundreds of thousands of individuals whose security is jeopardized by what they did with us before, and who somehow are going to have to try to find a way out of the country. But we haven't even gotten the special immigrant visa holders out of the country yet. There are over 60,000, the State Department said the other day. And again, that's both those who served for 2 years on the ground with our forces as interpreters, battlefield interpreters, plus their family members, all of whose security is very much in jeopardy. Their paperwork is actually either submitted and approved or in process. So these numbers are hard. And I suspect there are even many more who have not initiated that process, but are trying to and finding it difficult to do so now that we no longer have an embassy and consulates in the country. So again, yes, we have not met our moral obligation to those that we said we would take care of, especially the battlefield interpreters. No One Left Behind, on whose board of advisors I sit, is trying to help them But the bottleneck for getting them out of the country is very, very substantial, and the flow can be only described as glacial at best.
It is, but you mentioned about U.S. Embassy. Now U.S. Embassy operates out of Qatar, and Qatar and also at the same time Emirates are more involved in Afghanistan. Well, how do you see their role going on, like in Afghanistan? How do you see their roles with having being involved in Afghanistan?
Well, the UAE and Qatar have been very helpful, frankly. Both of those countries and some others in the Gulf states certainly were particularly helpful during the very substantial withdrawal of Afghans from the country, over 120,000, and not all by our U.S. Air Force, but the vast majority of them. And in those very chaotic days of literally just putting people on planes and getting them off the airport in Kabul and then landing in the UAE and Qatar, of course, they sought to see to their basic needs, as the United States did likewise, and then also determined who are these individuals, what is their status, have they been put through the process before, do they have a special immigrant visa or a green card or some other legitimizing document to get them to the United States. If not, what do we do with them, and on and on. So, and also, of course, it was in the middle of a pandemic and they don't have the shots needed to enter the country, et cetera. So again, these two countries stand out in particular for what they have done. I would also add that the UAE also stood out because it provided special forces, F-16 aircraft, CH-47s, great diplomats, and also great development workers. When I was privileged to serve as the commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, and they continued that for right up until the end. And so they have relationships, their fellow Islamic countries, they want to help commendably, and they are indeed doing that. Qatar, of course, also has hosted, since we requested it all the way back when I was the Central Command commander, partnering with Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, the FPAC representative of the President and Secretary of State, to conduct the negotiations with the Taliban leadership, which ultimately, of course, resulted in the agreement that was signed during the Trump administration, which pledged our withdrawal by the spring of this year, extended, of course, by the Biden administration until a bit longer than that.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Just you're involved also in No One Left Behind. You can help a lot of women, right? So how do you see the future of Afghan women going on with all these things? No one talk about the women at all, except the women themselves. They stage protest and they're demanding to be back at work and have access to education.
Well, again, this is all predictable, and you may recall I did predict this and did, say that I feared these various outcomes that we are now seeing, which is that 50% of the population would find that it no longer has the same opportunities to work, to go to school, to participate in the economy, even to leave the house without a male guardian, to determine their own fate. Again, in many respects, all of this has sadly come true. There are other groups that I support or assist in some way that have helped to get hundreds, not thousands, of Afghan women from the American University of Afghanistan to third countries, other countries. The woman who had the scholarship that my wife and I fund is outside the country studying in another country. But again, these are small numbers. And again, obviously 50% of the population of nearly 40 million understandably as women. So that does not say much about what it is that we've been able to do in the main. And again, this is one of the issues, one of the many issues that the US rightly has with the Taliban leadership. And again, I don't think we're going to recognize the Taliban until they do meet these kinds of requirements that have been established by the US and other coalition countries. And so there's going to be a bit of an impasse, but an impasse around which countries need to find various conduits to get assistance to the people just to keep them from starving this winter.